Welcome to the Love is Our Nature podcast, where we discuss all things ranging from love, relationships, authenticity, fulfillment, to lessons from plant medicine journeys, inner healing, and living your truth. I'm not your teacher, I'm only your fellow student. Occasionally, you also get to hear some of my own healing process and journey back to love. The point of the program? That you take away at least one actionable piece of knowledge that supports you in expanding whatever aspect of your life your heart most desires. My name is Cesar Rodriguez. I will be your host, and I am honored to have you here. Happy listening. Welcome to the Love is Our Nature podcast. Here I am again. I'm so excited to record this episode. I have Alnoor Ladha with me. Let me tell you who Alnoor is. Alnoor Ladha is an activist, political strategist, writer, and community organizer. He was the co-founder of The Rules, a social justice think tank focused on systemic alternatives to neoliberal capitalism and a social movement support organization. He is also a co-founder of Tierra Valiente, or Brave Earth, a center for applied cultural transition based in the northwest jungle of Costa Rica. Alnoor, welcome to the Love is Our Nature podcast. How are you?
Good. Thanks for having me, Cesar. Good to see you.
Yeah, good to see you again. So Alnoor and I met at the Visionaries Immersion Retreat that Tish and her team facilitated. It was an amazing event. What was your favorite part of that retreat, Alnoor?
I'm not a big fan of gatherings like that personally, so I'll deflect the question.
Yeah. Okay. Well, you shared some pretty awesome information in the retreat. That's where I first got to meet you. So I was very appreciative of that opportunity, and I might ask you some things about some of the things that you shared in there. Sure. So. Just really happy that you joined us. Thank you for making this time. And yeah, I want to start by giving listeners the opportunity to get to know you a little bit more, right? So you're down in Costa Rica. I'm in Miami right now, by the way. So why don't you tell us a little bit about how you got to Costa Rica, a little bit about your background and who you are and what you do?
Sure. Yeah. And maybe just to say one thing on the visionary thing, part of my hesitation is even the conception of the idea of visionary, right? Like going to a gathering called Visionaries does not make you a visionary. I don't think people are visionaries as a descriptor of beingness. I see that as a function, and functions are temporarily held by members of communities. And usually visionaries were initiated members of a community, elders, seers, prophetic voices, etc., that temporarily held the function of being a visionary. And it's not them who's doing it, right? There's usually psychedelic medicines or liminal threshold states and let's say oxygen, ancestors, all these other forces, right? So no one who actually has the function and capabilities of being a visionary would ever call themselves that. And so I just, put all of that out there to disassociate myself with the idea that I was at a gathering where we were self-proclaiming ourselves as visionaries. So just all a bit embarrassing. So maybe just to say that first. And then to answer your question on my background and where I'm from. So I'm born in Vancouver. Immigrant parents from East Africa. My mom's family is from Zanzibar in Tanzania. My dad's family is from Uganda. They come from a diaspora tribe that came from a Sufi impulse. So there's a Arabic, Persian, Egyptian, Indian migratory path that led them to East Africa. And then they met in Vancouver in the 70s. They went their different migratory routes and met there, for all the ills and shadow of globalization. There's also that aspect. the beauty and the serendipity of what happens in a disjointed, fragmented world. So I grew up in Vancouver, and my background is in political strategy, in climate change, in social movement work, in narrative work, media narrative analysis work, discourse analysis, and I've also been doing alternative healing work for the past 20 years or so. And I'm mainly interested in this intersection between politics and spirituality, mysticism and anarchism.
Mysticism and anarchism.
Anarchism.
Okay. How do those two intersect?
So, anarchism is not anarchy. Anarchism is a very sophisticated political philosophy that has a history older than Marxism or socialism. It was born in Europe in the 1800s, as it is articulated in a particular way, because it's, of course, in some ways the true nature of human beings. And anarchism is about localizing food production, decision-making, democracy, community processes. There's a key principle of anarchism, which is subsidiarity, which is the idea that the people most affected by the decisions at a local level should be the people who make those decisions. It's very simple, right? It's in direct opposition to liberal democracy and electoral democracies, which allow us to elect somebody else to make decisions for us every 4 years and treat democracy as another consumerist product. And it's one of the large drivers and root issues of why our culture is so messed up and why corporate and political power is so concentrated in the hands of very few undemocratic and untrustworthy people. And so anarchism is the sort of antidote to that. And another key principle of anarchism is, one of the kind of taglines of the anarchist political philosophy is no gods, no masters. So there's a deep belief in individual and community and bioregional sovereignty. And I also come from as I said, a Sufi mystical impulse. And one of the key tenets of mysticism is the Gnostic impulse. And gnosis means direct relationship with wisdom or knowledge or the divine. It's an unmediated relationship. So in some ways, the tagline of anarchism, no gods, no masters, also relates into the mystical tradition of no priests, no Bibles, no imams, no Qurans, no hierarchy. One of the sort of initial early teachings of Sufism is Allah is a metaphor for the universe becoming self-aware. So God is a metaphor for the universe becoming self-aware through you, through us, through the collective unfolding of life and consciousness on the planet and in other realms.
Amazing. It's interesting how people think of anarchism as, I think you tell anarchism to the average person, they think of like Mad Max and like everybody just running rampant, like stealing from everybody, right? How do you think the concept of anarchy went from what you just described to like the common conception of or understanding of what anarchism is?
I think there's been a very sophisticated propaganda campaign against the idea for 250 years. I think anyone who reads and understands and thinks about political philosophy will understand it's probably the only sane political philosophy that exists. And actually, we're living in a Mad Max world right now, right? People are stealing and pillaging and raping the planet and taking us to the brink of extinction. And we call it order because, maybe 5% of the population has the comforts of Amazon.com and big screen TVs in their house. And so, and as I said, anarchy became a pejorative term to talk about like a structureless, lawless society. And anarchy and anarchism are not the same thing, but they come from the same Latin root, which is an without arc hierarchy. So it's literally the more accurate definition of what democracy would be if we did not live in a patriarchal, capitalist, white supremacist, fascist culture.
Right. Okay. And you're an activist. Why don't you share a little bit about your activism? What is it that you support in your work as an activist?
Yeah, activism is such a loaded term that I also feel very resistant to, right? It's like, these are the special people over here who care, right? And it's like, no, I'm just trying to be and practicing being a responsible citizen of our times. And so the issue areas that I try to focus on is mainly one big inquiry, which is how do we create transition infrastructure for post-capitalist realities, for alternative worlds, for adjacent possible futures. And when you dig one level below that, if that's the work, part of my quote unquote activism work is to be a good student of my culture and the dominant culture that stemmed in Western Europe and was really amplified in the US, and then through colonialism, imperialism, genocide, slavery, etc., was quote unquote development, through the World Bank and the IMF and Monsanto and the Gates Foundation and the government corporate nexus, and spread all over the world. And so part of the work is to understand how the disease that is modern Western culture and the culture of industrial capitalism and the culture of the live, work, consume, die metaphysics of capitalist modernity, how that has infected culture everywhere, and how it colonizes my own body and the bodies of those around me and the natural world and the more than human world, and all of that. And so part of my work is to really just understand how the superstructure of capitalism works, and then to work on addressing, sometimes through resistance, sometimes through renewal and regeneration, key aspects and tenets of the neoliberal structure. And so I've worked on issues such as land rights and supporting landless people's movements, food justice and food sovereignty work, working with peasant farmer movements, the rights of nature, working with indigenous peoples, tax justice and economic justice work. I've spent time on sort of many of the key pillars of the dominant system, and sort of always with that more structural lens, a more constellational worldview, which is a practice. It's not like you have that bigger picture, but it's that systems view is part of what informs what work I spend energy and time on and how I can support, and really thinking through like what are the acupuncture points to speed up both the destruction of this existing system and the creation of the more beautiful possibilities we know exist and already exist in many ways.
Yeah, there's a lot I want to ask you about what you just said, but a real short question I want to ask you before that is how did you end up or wind up with devoting yourself to all these things, like with these concerns?
Growing up in a Sufi tradition really influenced a lot of my early thinking, and really trying to embody ideas of non-separation and ideas of empathy. And so when you start feeling what's actually happening in the world, and the suffering that's happening, and 80% of humanity is still living under $10 a day, and 200 species a day are going extinct, and ocean acidification and catastrophic climate change and ecosystems collapse and perpetual war and domestic violence and all of these really sort of externalities of the culture. These are the logical outcomes of a culture that's focused on greed, on consumption, on short-termism, on extraction. And so for me, there's no other sane response than to want to commit yourself to wanting to support the transition in some ways. And then really studying anarchism in my 20s and going to grad school for political philosophy, I started to more deeply understand how these structures are man-made, and I'm not saying human-made. They're mostly have been created by white males, white European males and North American and males. And so if they are man-made, they can be remade and recreated and recalibrated and recast and all of those things. And so that motivated me, and understanding that these are not the crisis we're in is not simply a political crisis or an economic crisis or a social crisis or a cultural crisis. It is a meta crisis stemming from separation from the natural world and the more than human world, rooted in like a loss of metaphysical and spiritual understanding. And so there's an entire complex of things happening that have left us bereft of a culture worthy of the name culture, and bereft of a belief system that has any meaningful cosmology or mythopoetic narrative, or even really ethical landscape in which to make decisions outside the stupidity of the invisible hand and selfishness and consumption.
Yeah. Thank you. You referred to modern Western culture as a disease, and I could sure name many reasons why I think that's the case. I don't want to have it go as a foregone conclusion for the listeners. And you did mention a couple of things now, like 80% of people living at $10 a day, 200 species a day going extinct. Why else would you say that modern Western culture is a disease?
Well, look, let's take when I say that, I'm not saying necessarily that if another dominant culture, let's say, China decided to not retire their navy in the 1500s and 1600s and decided to take on a similar path of imperialism and psychosis and cannibalism as Western Europeans did, we would have another set of problems, right? And there would be another set of consequences, but that's not the case. So I'm not suggesting for a communist future or a socialist future. I'm suggesting post-capitalist futures, which is not anti-capitalist. It's gesturing towards possibilities and realities that don't exist, right? Where we could create, and we will create, a world where justice, harmony, equity consciousness, generosity, altruism, interbeing, and solidarity with all life are the values and principles and ethical framework for which we orient ourselves. So we just look at this culture and it's basically the opposite of that culture, right? And so what is the dominant culture? Well, you just look around us and you'll see what it is. The logical outcome of this culture is monoculture. It's the monoculture of the mind. It's the monoculture of the soul. If we just allowed capitalist modernity to go on this current trajectory, everyone would have, Nike shoes and an Apple computer and Microsoft software and Google desktops and listening to Beyonce or Miley Cyrus or whatever, and listening to, CNN or Fox News and driving, Chevrolets or Toyotas or whatever. And that monoculture it's a self-terminating logic. So by definition, it will destroy the world. There's not enough resources for people to consume. We would need 7 planet Earths to maintain the level of consumption that we consume in the West, for example. So there's no way to look at this thing when you have a long-term view. We are now living in the age of consequence. There's maybe 20 years left at best of the Western way of living. You can take that from an economic perspective. The current growth debt-based system requires at least 3% growth, right? And I don't know if you want me to get into this.
Yeah, actually, I was going to ask you about that. You talked about this 20-year cycle in the retreat, and I found that very intriguing. I never heard that before. You said like that this capitalistic system requires it to double every 20 years. Is that right? Could you go into that a bit more?
Yeah. So what we have, what neoliberalism is. So, and it's an important word to know what neoliberalism is. It's the dominant brand and the current incarnation stemming from 12,000 years of totalitarian agriculture, 5,000 years of the city-state model, and a hierarchy and patriarchy and the militarization of human life. And it's just its most current form. And it's this belief in market fundamentalism, the individual as the root of all decision making and cultural purchase. Margaret Thatcher's famous line, the former Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, there's no such thing as society. There's only the individual and the family unit. It's this very deep belief that if you take care of yourself only and you behave selfishly, that wealth will trickle down to others. That there's no historical lens on it. It's pull yourself up by the bootstraps, winner takes all, without looking at the 5,000 year weight of modernity that has privileged essentially white bodies to disproportionately benefit from capital accumulation through all the dispossession and destruction that their ancestors have wreaked and havoc on this planet. And so it's essentially a historical worldview. And the way neoliberalism works is that we have, it's a debt-based and therefore growth-based system. So I'll give you a very simple kind of metaphor on this, which is like the 1, 2, 3, 5 rule. So anyone can remember this, right? If somebody asks you, how does the global economic system works? This is a very like basic 101 answer to how that works. Federal Reserve systems owned by governments. So the government and bank nexus is at the root of the system. Finance capital is the driving force of a neoliberal economy. Print money at debt, at 1% debt. Commercial banks basically create that money into existence by asking the Federal Reserve to print that money. They then lend that money out at 2%, which is prime, what we call prime interest. That goes through the economy, through the multiplier. The growth rate has to be higher than the interest rate for the money to be valuable, right? It's basically a Ponzi scheme of sorts. So the pie, the debt creation of the pie, let's call it like the yeast, is growing at like 2%. And so for the pie to be able to be paid back, to be like financially viable, the growth rate becomes 3% roughly. It's the minimum World Bank and IMF and bankers and lawyers will tell you, and economists will tell you, is necessary to keep the whole house of cards afloat. So that the global economy is growing at 3%, which doesn't sound like a lot, but it's an exponential function. So 3% growth per year means a doubling of the global economy every 20 years, which means twice as many Big Macs, twice as much industrial agriculture, twice as much extraction of resources, twice as many cars on the road, twice as much rubber, twice as much destruction of the Amazon, twice as much pollution of water, twice as much fracking, et cetera, et cetera. Which is unfathomable, right? We've already crossed
Right.
4 of the 9 planetary bounds. So from an ecological perspective, there will not be another doubling. And from an economic perspective, money is just an IOU. So there will not be another economic doubling. And so we have both economists and ecologists agree there will not be another 20-year cycle left on the horizon. And so then the 5% is important. The 1, 2, 3, 5, to just complete that metaphor, is important because 5% is the return on capital, which essentially means that if you, in a debt-based system, if you have capital, you become exponentially rich as a capital holder. And if you have debt, you become exponentially poor, because we've invented this thing of compound interest. So, on average, this is in the work of Thomas Piketty, who wrote Capital in the 21st Century. It's like an 800-page tome on 250 years of econometric data showing capital holders on average are getting 5%. Now, if you're part of the power elite and a 1%er and your money's in hedge funds, that might mean you're getting 8%, 12%, 15% return on this made up capital, right? And what that means is that they're getting a disproportionate piece of the pie. So it's not that inequality or poverty, these are just externalities, right? As economists call it, these are sad byproducts that are fixable. No, this is the logical outcome of the system. The system is hardwired to create inequality, poverty, zero-sum logic, climate change, because we have a fossil fuel extractive-based system. These are the logical outcomes of capitalism. There is no fixing the problems that we are facing as a civilization without addressing the root of debt, growth-based industrial capitalism.
Yeah, and you said also like not even cryptocurrency is a solution, right? There's a lot of crypto hype men out there saying like Bitcoin is the answer, right?
Yeah, like the crypto utopians are essentially what are they? They're speculative investors who are biased because they put their money in a thing that they believe, whether truthfully or not, that is going to solve the problems of a debt-based, growth-based system, when the value of their actual currency is pegged to the US dollar. Why is Bitcoin valuable? Because it's worth 33,000 US dollars, and you can exchange it for debt-based capital. There's no solution in that. It's a diversification of means of exchange, and outside of Bitcoin or Ether or whatever, the technology of blockchain could be useful, but it's not useful right now. It's taking up huge amounts of energy, and it's making essentially mostly white Silicon Valley males richer, who then fuel the hype of an alternative that doesn't exist. So all this grasping for silver bullets, this is part of the psychology of being in late stage capitalism. It's the psychology of being at the end of history and the end of time. And our bodies know it on some level. So we're either in complete optimism or complete denial, or some kind of tech utopian, crypto utopian future that makes us feel better about ourselves, believing that we're saving the world by enriching ourselves through crypto. But they're all functionally equivalent in the sense that they are not useful to the context in which we are operating.
Yeah, and like you said, I mean, the system is all intertwined at this point. So even, I mean, with your Bitcoin, you're going to buy stuff that was manufactured inside of the same system anyway, right?
Yeah, exactly. And there's the production consumption argument. It's just within the same economy. That's not a circular economy. It's not a regenerative economy. It's an extractive, globalized supply chain of destruction that is not going to last. And then also the fact that we don't know what collapse is going to entail and what that even means, right? The latest IPCC report came out 2 days ago. the International Panel on Climate Change, put together by the UN. You know, it was front page of the New York Times and the headlines around the world. All of the feedback loops that scientists are predicting for the last 30, 40 years are happening at faster and faster rate, right? What it's going to mean to be on a planet with a 2-degree or 3-degree rise in temperature by 2050, which is not far away, you know, it's 30 plus years away, is unfathomable, right? We're talking, there's one, just to give you an example, there's one feedback loop, which is the Siberian ice sheet, that holds 12 times more carbon in the form of methane. So it's faster acting, more dangerous, 12 times more carbon. So we've already increased temperature by 1 degree since the Industrial Revolution. And so now we're going to release 12 times that in one feedback loop. So as that ice melts, it's in smaller and smaller pieces. Those pieces are melting faster, hence this negative feedback loop. Then you have Exxon, Shell, Total, etc., all the fossil fuel companies now digging under those ice sheets because there's access to fossil fuels, which is then creating smaller pieces of ice, which is speeding up the whole thing faster. So we have no idea what's coming down the pipeline. The psychosis and the greed and the desire to take as much as we can and be as comfortable as we can before life as we know it obliterates 95% of humanity and most of the ecosystems in the way we understand them now. The earth itself will, of course, be fine and will self-regulate, is so insane, right? Like, that's what we're facing. So even the belief that we will have internet and working satellites and functioning energy grids, like, this is all delusional thinking. We have no idea what is going to happen. Like, the people who are going to survive the consequences of our actions as a species are those who live in community and those who are food sovereign, energy sovereign, water sovereign, medicine sovereign. Just to warn you, I'm in the middle of a storm here in Costa Rica. So at some point, if this ends, we might have to do a part 2. I hear a lot of thunder coming. So
yeah, so far
not,
we've heard you perfectly clearly. So that's great. So one thing that I gather from what you're saying is the collapse is inevitable, right? You said earlier you're working creating transition infrastructure for post-capitalism realities, right? For post-capitalist realities. So in other words, what you're saying is there's no way around our system collapsing as we know it.
I wouldn't say collapse is a singular event, right? I would say there are fields of possibility where collapse of some kind is inevitable, and those are the probability-wise, the dominant probability is that collapse of the monetary system, collapse of globalized, industrialized supply chains, collapse of nation states, collapse of democracies as we know it, widespread violence, widespread unrest, widespread chaos is the most likely outcome of the trajectory we are on now. There is possibility and very little probability that we could change that by changing the structure of the system itself. But unless you address the root of a growth-based, debt-based system, we are pissing in the wind. So all of us might have our, innovation ideas and technology ideas and social capitalist ideas and conscious capitalist ideas of let's build Tom shoes and sell one shoe and give another and build our retreat centers in Costa Rica, and it's all functionally meaningless unless we are spending at least 50% of our energy, as a civilization or each or however you are, changing the actual structure of the system and creating alternative models and creating strong localized economies and communities, which is the only thing that's going to guarantee less suffering and more human beings living in symbiosis with the living planet. Everything we are doing is a waste of time.
Mm.
Regenerative retreat center in Costa Rica and all the new age alternative healing modalities. All of this is distraction. If we do not have a point of view or an understanding how the global economic system works, what the trajectory of our culture, where it is taking us, and what the consequences of our consumption and our convenience of of this way of living is. Till we understand that, we are not contextually sensitive. That means, therefore, we are not contextually useful. Therefore, we are not contextually relevant.
Mm. Okay, that's one thing I want to kind of drill down in this point a little bit more, because I'd like to understand it better. Right, you said that those who would survive this transition, are those who are food sovereign, water sovereign, medicine sovereign, live in community. You mentioned a couple other things.
Indigenous cultures, people who have an unbroken history of living in place with right. their local cultures and geographies, and understanding plants, local ecosystems, etc. Yeah.
So, what then? So, I mean, you and I know that there's retreat centers like every day almost. There's a new retreat center in Costa Rica, right? And some of them are doing a lot of great work. What is it that they're missing then? Like, what's the difference? Like, if they're growing their own food, they're harvesting their medicines, they're living in harmony with the land, they're living in community. How is that not what you're saying is the people that will survive? What am I missing here?
Well, let's flip the question. How is what they're doing changing the broader economic operating system of neoliberalism? Like, if this is not just about survival of them, right? Like,
Gotcha.
if the strategy is just for self-survival, well, okay, yeah, that's a good strategy. But we need to start organizing at a global level to create bioregional sovereignty, right? And that requires collaboration and cooperation at a bioregional level. That requires political organizing and activism work to resist nation-state governmental control. That requires being in service and support to indigenous communities that hold the wisdom of place and ancestral wisdom. It requires a lot more of us than just creating doomsday communities for new agers.
Right. Yeah, I see it now. So yeah, it's not about living in like this little fairy tale land where like we get to take care of ourselves and that's it, right? There's a bigger picture here.
Exactly.
Okay.
Can you hear the rain and the thunder? It's pretty loud. Oh no, you're good.
Yeah. Good. You got a great headset. So can you just explain a bit more what's bioregional sovereignty, just so it's clearer?
Yeah, so this sort of conception of the nation state it's made up, right? Like the Treaty of Westphalia in the 1600s invented the idea of the nation state. So, most countries have been declared made up borders created by imperialists and colonialists. There's no such thing as Canada or the US or the United Kingdom or Australia or Japan or whatever. These are just ideas that we've calcified into nation-state borders. An island like Japan is slightly different, right? The island itself although it has many ecosystems within it, could be argued that is a bioregion. But bioregions are the natural ending and beginning of place. So where rivers end and begin, where mountains begin and end, where forests begin and end, where waterways of all types begin and end. So it's how the world, from a biomimetic sense, would organize itself, as opposed to these made-up nation-state borders. And that's a much more interesting way to organize, because we can share food systems within those regions, seeds within those regions, medicines within those regions, etc. And that is in some ways the ideal, let's call it ancient futures
Hmm.
right? Because this is how we used to organize life, because that's what made sense for the natural world. And it's how we will in a post-collapse environment.
Hmm. Hmm. Okay, I understand now. So it's not, it's more like the natural boundary lines, not the made up ones that we drew on a map.
Exactly.
I see. Um, so the I heard it said at I told you I might ask you some hard questions, right? So the maybe this is one of them. Some people might say that you sound very doom and gloomy, right? And at one point I had that experience listening to you talk at first, right? But then I really appreciated the education and the wake up call. Um, what what do I want to ask here? What would you say about that? And what are like some of the solutions that you suggest where you're not just saying like, hey everybody, like there's no way out. Like, do you have something to offer people as to solutions beyond what you've already shared?
I would turn the question around. I would say both the desire and expectation for somebody to give you solutions because they make your worldview slightly uncomfortable is an
Mhm.
entitled position, as is the desire to keep the optimistic utopian bubble because of the circle of privilege that you operate in.
Mhm.
You're not entitled to that. There are physics and natural ecosystem cascades that are happening in the world. The ecological collapse that is happening as a direct result of the way you and I live is not something I need to persuade you of.
Mhm.
Whether you want to believe it or not, that is a choice you have to make spiritually and karmically. So we could see what's happening in the world as um, affliction, something happening to us, or we could see it as assignment.
Mm.
And I borrowed this language from Stephen Jenkinson, who's a teacher on death and dying. We can see what's happening as affliction or assignment.
Mhm.
And so by me stating what is really obvious to the majority of the world, especially people living in global south who are directly affected by climate change, whose lives have been not just drastically altered, but primarily driven by the consumption patterns of Western Europe and North America for 500 years of colonialism and pillage. The people who are on the front lines of this and the more than human world, the multiple species that are dying, the ecosystems that are dying, like everyone else is on page. People understand, the more than human world understands what's happening, right? Like the guy in Enteleki is in some ways withdrawing her support from us,
Mm.
right? She's sitting with, well, is this in some ways an interesting evolved species with this complex neocortex that is the youngest species on the planet that holds this great potential for potentially even taking Gaian life outside of our solar system? Is this interesting little primate experiment worth the destruction it's wreaking on the planet right now?
Mm.
That's in question. Now, whether you want to be in on that negotiation or not is up to you. Whether
Right.
you want to stay in the Western bubble of shopping on Amazon.com and eating at Whole Foods and thinking everything's going to be great for a really long time, and all my kids need to do is get into private school and get the right job and get into the right university and all of that bullshit. Well, you can continue living in that fairy world, right?
Right.
Fairyland. Like that fairy tale has ended. The task of our parents' generation and the spirit task of our generation is very different. We are inheriting a dying planet. We may be the last species left, the last of our species left, or our children will be potentially the last humans left. And this is a direct consequence of the way we are living.
Mm.
So it is not our fault, but it is our responsibility.
Mm.
And I'm not here to persuade you on how to play out your karma and dharma.
Mhm.
If you want to be contextually relevant, well, then wake the fuck up. If you don't want to be contextually relevant, enjoy your next Amazon.com order, right? It's like I'm not here to give people solutions and alternatives and to coach them and be their psychotherapist and make them feel better about their role in the world and how they're handling their privilege.
And
Now,
what if somebody? Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah.
Go ahead. No, go ahead.
And on the second point of what are the solutions? Well, I've laid out what some of those solutions are. I come from a mystical tradition spiritually and an anarchist tradition politically. I'm not in the business of telling people what to do. I am a flawed human being. I'm not into solutionism. I don't think there's a linear X and Y cause and effect way to get out of this mess. I think we are in the middle of a deep spiritual cosmic initiation of proportions we can't even imagine. The very future of our civilization, our species is online here. This is what's at stake. And it's going to require the deepest healing and transformation at a genetic, epigenetic, cultural, spiritual, multidimensional level. And the people who are up for that are going to continue to reincarnate and attempt to make this experiment, at least see it to its very end, whatever that is. And we have a choice on what archetypal role we want to play in this cosmic drama. You want to be a consumer? You want to be a passive participant? You want to be someone whose hand has to be held so you feel better in the shopping line with your shopping cart? Well, go ahead. That's not my business.
Right. Gotcha. Yeah, thank you. That was awesome. I want to talk a little bit about Tierra Valiente, Brave Earth. You live in a alternative community that you co-founded with your brother. I understand.
I co-founded it. We co-founded it with 25 people.
Okay.
My brother just happens to be one of them. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. I see. And what was your motivation for it? And what is your vision for it?
The motivation was to just really live our values. I was living first, obviously I said I was from Vancouver and I moved to the UK for grad school. I stayed in London for many years. I moved to New York and lived there for many years. I moved to South Africa to be in solidarity with social movements there and the Pan-African movement and anti-colonialist struggles. And then I didn't want to end up in Costa Rica. I used to joke that the last two places in the world I ever want to end up are Bali and Costa Rica. Too many new age people, too many healing centers, all of that. And the universe was like, you have preference, slaps me in the face and says, enjoy. And so the intention was essentially to make our attempt at an experiment in living in post-capitalist ways. So we bought the land, we put into a trust. We believe in stewardship, not ownership. There's a direct democracy governance structure. We run it as a cooperative with the local community. The profits go into a mutual aid network in the bioregion. We're not just trying to be food sovereign ourselves, we're trying to create bioregional food sovereignty. And it's an experiment. And the idea of vision, I also feel, it's a bit of a neoliberal concept in the sense of here's our mission statement and our vision statement, and this is what we're going to do. It's we bow to divine emergence. We have a prayer rather than a vision, which is to be a useful experiment that may help others and embody post-capitalist realities that are based on trust, generosity, sovereignty, gift economy, interbeing with life, solidarity with the global field, etc. And I don't want to pretend that we have any answers. We're just in an experiment. We're 5 years into an experiment. We're not looking for people to come and visit and selling workshops and being excited about that. I don't want to be in the promotional game. It's we're doing our experiment. We're happy when other people are doing their experiments. We're great to know about it and be in touch. And no one has the answer to what's coming. We're all just trying to practice and build these atrophied muscles around what it is to live in community and to live in symbiosis with land and to be in permission and dialogue with the living planet and the living cosmos, as opposed to imposing our will on how we think things should go down.
Mhm. I see. Wonderful.
Just so you know, I just got a warning that the internet's going to go down,
Okay.
and I'm also looking at time. So
Yeah,
maybe
that's
we do one
perfect.
more. We do one more question.
Yeah,
You're up for it.
exactly. We are almost out of time here. So, yeah, the question I'd love to ask my guests here is, what are you most passionate about?
Um, I think the things that enliven me are um, being in the practice of losing my identity,
Mm.
and stepping outside of the story of the small I self that is, attached to the ego and preference and um, the need for external validation. And so when I'm in the space of service and in the space of listening and really asking, how do I best be in service to the collective unfolding and the context and the times we're in? And what does that require of me? And how do I be in service to that? And just asking that question and being in dialogue with the response and the omens that come, that's where my passion comes from. This idea of like, I liked reading science books when I was 8, and therefore, like, my passion is around that. I feel this is just like calcified, egoic aspects of ourselves when we thought we were something. I want to get to a state where I have no passion or no preference outside of what the living planet and the animate cosmos is asking of me now.
Mm.
And when I can get into that state, I'm enlivened, I'm in my flow. And when I'm not in that state, I'm just another egoic, Western socialized, preference ridden consumer.
Right. Right. Beautiful. Well, thank you so much for sharing everything that you did with
Yeah,
us.
my pleasure.
I'm interested as to how you're going to answer this. I usually love to give the opportunity for my guests to share any contacts in case for those people that feel inspired, they want to learn more about what the information that you've shared. Is there anything you want to share as far as how people could get in touch with you or anything like that?
No, I'd rather not. Like, I'm not looking like for networking or the expansion of,
Right.
it's like, for me, that's just another form of commodification. I think
Right.
even the separation that there is a me and there is a you, right?
Mm.
It's like, um, if anything I said was useful, just think of it as an aspect of you reminding you of what you already know and what enlivens you. And if ideas around post-capitalism or whatever excites you, to then embody those values and be in the inquiry and the contemplation and the research and the practice of those things that inspire you. Like, I don't
Mm.
need to be brought into that experience of yours. And
Right.
I'm not entitled to that. And I don't want to be burdened with that. And you're not entitled to that. And I don't want to burden you with that, you know. And so that is the practice of non-separation, is treating the other as God reflecting back to us aspects of ourselves that we may like or dislike,
Yeah. Yeah.
and taking the
All
full
right.
responsibility of sitting with that.
Nice.
Yeah.
Perfect. Well, Alnoor, thank you so much. I, for one, am inspired by the work you're doing. So I really appreciate it. I'm sure our listeners will enjoy everything that you shared. And just thank you for being a guest again in the Love is Our Nature podcast. I look forward to meeting you again soon. And is there anything else you'd like to say before we close?
Maybe one thing, because I don't want to sound like a dour pessimist either. Um,
Yeah.
I had this recent insight, which maybe I share, um, that in the midst of all of this chaos and the carnival of capitalist modernity, that one of the games that we are playing with ourselves is finding our godhood in the midst of this carnival,
Mm.
and that our lives are these comedic shamanic acts we are performing on ourselves, and that we have to be very careful in choosing which archetypal roles we want to play in the midst of this shamanic act. We
Mm.
want to be the jester. We want to be the ignorant consumer in the corner. Do we want to be an active player? Do we want to be the assassin in the shadows? Do we want to be the mystic praying for the collective healing and the liberation of all souls? Whatever that archetypal role is. And that, to just close the theme of this podcast, a definition of love that came to me was, love is the insane desire to reincarnate. Love is the insane desire to reincarnate. You would not come into this world in incorporeal form as a life-destroying Homo sapien at the end of time, unless you were in love with Pachamama, you were in love with the various ecosystems and biomes and biospheres of her bounty. If we were not in love with the other human beings and the more than human beings that we chose to reincarnate with at the same time, like, this is why we're here now.
Wow.
And we can choose, to see this as affliction, or we can choose to see that as assignment in our marching orders.
Wow. That's beautiful. Well, there you have it, listeners. Thank you for listening to this episode. Thank you for choosing to be in this incarnation, doing this work in this transition that the world is going through. And thank you, Alnoor, for, I want to say your leadership, but I don't know how you would react to that.
Not well.
What was that?
I said not well.
Oh yeah. All right. Well, that's everything, folks. Thank you so much. I really enjoyed this conversation, and see you all soon. Subscribe to the podcast. Give it a like if you enjoyed it. Share with your friends, and we'll see you in the next episode. Bye, Alnoor.
Hello, brother. Thank you for having me. We'll talk soon.
My pleasure.
Bye.
That is all, folks. I hope you enjoyed this episode. Thank you for being a valued listener. If you haven't already, remember to subscribe to the podcast in whatever your favorite platform is. You can also watch the video version of the episode on the Love is Our Nature YouTube channel. Check out loveisOurNature.com as well. That's where you can see our latest news and most recent content. If you enjoyed the episode, leave a review, share it with your friends, or email me. I love hearing what you took away for yourself out of listening. My email is Caesar@loveIsOurNature.com. That's CESAR, or Cesar, like my mother says it, at loveIsOurNature.com altogether. Till next time, I'll be here rooting for you. And remember, whatever the question, love is the answer.